Hi there, welcome to A Mystery and a Mess. I'm Amanda, and this is my mess. Every week I pick one mess in my space to clean up, and while I clean, to entertain myself and hopefully you, I recount a fascinating true story. The stories are sometimes true crime, sometimes weird history, or wild science. This week I will be talking about the trial of Levi Weeks for the murder of Elma Sands, often recognized as the first murder trial with a written record in the U.S., and also the trial mentioned in the musical Hamilton.
Gentlemen of the jury, I'm curious, bear with me. Are you aware that we're making history? This is the first murder trial of our brand new nation, the liberty behind the liberation. I intend to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt with my assistant counsel.
Co-counsel Hamilton, sit down. A client Levi Weeks is innocent. Call your first witness. That was all you had to say.
Okay, one more thing.
Fire up those mirror neurons, and let's get cleaning. For the case itself, the only real content warnings are the murder of a young woman and some old-timey slut-shaming. But there's also the important and usual content warnings for my use of profanity as well as mediocre jokes to break the tension of a terrible story. It's also important to note in this particular retelling that I will make several references to the musical play Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda, and you don't need to know anything about the play or have seen it or anything to follow the story, because I am telling the factual story of the trial of Levi Weeks. Further, if you're a Hamilton fan, please be prepared for me to point out some inaccuracies between portrayals in the play and reality. I love the play Hamilton. I've watched it several times. It's absolutely marvelous, but it's important to acknowledge that it's not 100% accurate. A lot of artistic license was taken in its composition, and so I will point out some of those areas throughout the story, but I'll try to keep them as limited as I can because, again, you don't have to have seen the play to follow the story at all. And lastly, you get your classic old-timey warning that no one knows exactly what happened in this case, so there will be several instances of this or that. One thing I want to draw your attention to right away is this is not as messy as it was when I first showed it to you probably like a second ago, and that is because I filmed a huge portion of this video yesterday and then discovered when I reviewed it that the video and the sound was all messed up. So I've already halfway cleaned this counter before I discovered that error and was quite angry about it, to be frank. Today I am actually going to be moving. Also, you can forward ahead a few minutes if you want to get right to the story, but just an explanation of what the cleaning and the mess will be in today's video. I'm moving, and so I will be trying to film this video while also gathering up items and moving them between two houses. So we'll see how that goes. If it sucks, I can just retell the story in a better video later. Let me know what you think. Picture it. Manhattan, New York, 1799. The mood is somewhat somber in the young nation following a recent yellow fever epidemic and the death of President George Washington. At the boarding house in Manhattan owned by Elias Ring and his wife Catherine Ring, concerns run even deeper. Elma Sands, who is Catherine Ring's cousin and also a resident at their boarding house, is missing. Gulielma, or Elma as she's known by friends and family, went out of the house in good spirits in the evening of December 22nd, 1799, and she never returned. Elma's disappearance was very out of character for her, and it didn't take long for her cousins and friends to suspect foul play. Manhattan at that time was much less densely populated than it currently is, and it didn't take long for rumors to begin to fly. Word around town was that Elma had been romantically involved with another boarder at the Rings boarding house, a man called Levi Weeks. People were saying that the two were very close and had been out together the night that Elma disappeared. Elma's cousin Catherine Ring even claimed that Elma had told her the two were going to elope, and it became sort of common knowledge around the city that Elma had disappeared in her wedding dress, so her finery, this was pre-white wedding, that Elma had disappeared in her wedding dress and was very likely pregnant with Levi Weeks' body. A couple days after Elma's disappearance, a young boy playing behind his house in Lispenard's Meadow, which is in present-day Soho, found a lovely muff for keeping your hands warm. He cleaned it up, dried it, and gave it to his mother. Eventually, as tales of Elma's disappearance spread and were expanded upon around town, it was realized that the muff this child had given to his mother was actually the muff Elma had been wearing the night she disappeared. She had borrowed it from another boarder. So, packing up some games to move, and if you are interested in a game recommendation, Evolution. We freaking love this game. We love playing games, but like for family gaming night, this is the best. It has strategy, it has some really great scientific components and just beautiful art. So, Evolution, North Star Games, excellent game. So anyway, on January 2nd, 1800, Elias Ring and some other men went to Lispenard's Meadow to search for Elma, and they searched the Manhattan well in the meadow and discovered Elma's body. It was said that she was covered in bruises and her clothing was torn when she was recovered. And this is where the crisscrossing of our characters really starts to intermingle. You'll see throughout this story that a lot of the characters come into play in different times, and then throughout their lives they crisscross all over the place in various ways. And additionally, every other step of this story has another mystery and another story that could be told. So the Manhattan well in Lispenard's Meadow had been built by Aaron Burr. There are different accounts of this case, and you can basically tell whether the person writing the story loves Alexander Hamilton and hates Aaron Burr, or loves Aaron Burr and hates Alexander Hamilton, based on their telling of the history of Manhattan Well. And it does seem that even the most even-handed historians tend to have a real strong preference for either Hamilton or Burr. My partner himself, the even-handed history professor that he is, loves Aaron Burr and is not a fan of slave owner Alexander Hamilton. Those who love Alexander Hamilton tend to say that Burr only took on the Manhattan Well project and the waterworks for Manhattan in order to be able to build a bank of his own, and fans of Aaron Burr tend to say Aaron Burr did what he said he was going to do. He brought clean water to the city. He built wells. He laid pipes that brought in water to help relieve the yellow fever epidemic in the city, and that he started a bank perfectly legally under the charter that Alexander Hamilton himself had written. And I just don't understand why. I mean, I'm not a historian, but it's clearly both. He built the well. He started the bank. Great. Anyway, long story short, well, not short, but this Manhattan well that Aaron Burr had built, or had built, was owned by Aaron Burr. Elma's body was recovered from the well, which is coincidentally located at the present-day corner of Spring Street and Green in Manhattan, in the basement of 229 Spring Street. And I just find that really cool, that it's still there. It's down in the basement. Humorously, every account that you hear of this will have a name of a different business that is in that location, because they change hands so much. But yeah, it's there. It's in the basement. Here's a picture of it. Lots of stories about it being haunted and such. Those stories actually started immediately after Elma's body was discovered. There were a lot of rumors surrounding Elma's disappearance and Elma's death, and they were mainly about her relationship with Levi Weeks and about the well in Lisbernard's Meadow, the Manhattan well, being haunted. Within just a couple of days, there were handbills circulating about both of those topics, about Levi Weeks' relationship with Elma and accusations against him, and about goblins and ghosts dancing around the, oh hey kitty, goblins and ghosts dancing around, yes, he doesn't believe in ghosts. Goblins and ghosts dancing around the Manhattan well. So those rumors started then, and every time the well is given any attention in the media since then, again, stories of hauntings. So there was a coroner's jury, or a coroner's inquisition held, which at the time basically meant sort of what we would say is a grand jury convening at the same time that the autopsy was performed, so they could ask questions during the autopsy, and the doctors would discuss their findings as they went through. And at this coroner's inquest, there were a couple of major findings. One was that Elma Sands was definitely not pregnant. And the second was that she had been murdered. There were marks on her body. At least one of the doctors mentioned strangulation. There was some water in her lungs, which could indicate drowning, but it seemed to point mostly to strangulation to unconsciousness and then being thrown into the well. Similar to what was done in the Catherine Hayes case, the husband murder treason case a few weeks ago, Elma's body was displayed for the public outside of Ring's boarding house, and it's estimated that up to thousands of people may have passed by and examined the body. And this horrifies me because she had been in a well. And granted, it's January, it's Manhattan, December, January in Manhattan, but still, days in a well. Ugh. Anyway, following the determination that Elma had been murdered, no one was shocked when Levi Weeks, her alleged boyfriend, was charged with the crime. Being charged with murder was a much scarier prospect for a white man at that time in the U.S. than it is now. The baby U.S. court system was based on English common law, and most, if not all, attorneys in the country at that time had studied British common law. They were basically like Americanized British lawyers. And this matters because British common law in 1800, when the trial took place, did not include the right to a defense attorney. It wouldn't be until 1836 that Britain adopted the right to a defense attorney, and that was only in felony cases. So while being charged with murder was scary, Levi Weeks was lucky because his older brother was Ezra Weeks. And Ezra Weeks was a wealthy and respected architect and builder in New York. He's still known today. I knew I recognized his name when I was first reading this story. He's still known today as an architect and builder, or as the architect and builder of the Hamilton Grange yes, Alexander Hamilton's estate, and the Gracie Mansion, where the mayors of New York City live. So Ezra Weeks was able to help his brother assemble the U.S.'s first ever legal dream team. First, a man widely recognized as one of the best lawyers in New York City, and cited in a 1929 biography as the first American lawyer to prepare for trial beforehand. And I wish I was joking about that. The infamous Aaron Burr.
Your Excellency, sir. Who are you? Aaron Burr, sir.
Next, one of the best orators in the fledgling nation. 2 years out from torpedoing his own career with the very suspicious admission of adultery in the Reynolds pamphlet, and at this point in time leaning into undermining Burr's, or just starting to lean into undermining Burr's presidential hopes in the 1800 election, Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, was the second attorney on the team. And the thing is, Burr and Hamilton were both recognized as being phenomenal attorneys, but neither of them had much, if any, experience in criminal law, and especially not with capital murder. So the dream team was rounded off with one of the few attorneys in the country that actually had experience with murder trials, future Supreme Court Justice Henry Brockholst Livingston. Now, the amount of legal clout that was built up by this team sounds really expensive, but one of the things that a lot of accounts gloss over is the fact that Hamilton and Burr were both in a lot of debt at this time, and both of them owed Ezra Weeks money. Both of them had worked with Ezra Weeks on building projects, Aaron Burr on the Manhattan Well and related projects to that, and Alexander Hamilton on the Hamilton Grange. So the trial began on March 31st, 1800. Whoa! Losing Othello pieces here. Went under one of the shelves, so we'll pack Othello later. The trial began on March 31st, 1800, and was presided over by the mayor, a recorder, and Judge John Lansing Jr., who years after the trial would mysteriously vanish off the streets one day, never to be seen or heard from again. It's a complete mystery, and it's one of so many fascinating stories that sort of expand off from this one. Remind me or let me know down in the comments if you want to hear about the crazy stories surrounding Maria Reynolds, the woman from the Reynolds pamphlet, and I am not talking about anything that you saw in the play Hamilton. So, the story the prosecution laid out was basically the popular belief of what happened at the time. Elma Sands and Levi Weeks had been courting, probably intimately involved, and they had gone out together on the evening of December 22nd. Something had gone wrong, and Levi had strangled her and thrown her body in the well. The prosecutor was Cadwallader Colden, who would go on to be the mayor of New York. Prosecutor Cadwallader Colden, who would go on to become the mayor of New York, presented witnesses to testify to Elma's relationship with Levi and to having seen Elma go out the night of the murder with Levi, and according to some testimony. They testified to having seen Ezra Weeks's one-horse sleigh out that evening with a woman and 1 or 2 men in it. And it's notable that witnesses pointed out that the sleigh didn't have its bells on, which for a sleigh at that time, particularly at night, was a safety issue. It would have bells on it. I'm not gonna sing Jingle Bells. So there were witnesses that testified about seeing Ezra Weeks' sleigh out that night with a woman in it and 1 or 2 men. There was one gentleman who testified that he heard a woman screaming from Lispenard's meadow the night that Elma disappeared. And I say gentleman, but this is, hey, kitty cat, this is, I don't understand. And I did not read word for word this part of the testimony because we'll get into that. He heard a woman screaming, but apparently he did nothing to try to help, so whatever. Another man stated that the day after Elma's disappearance, he had seen a board off the well and footprints around the well. And then James Lent was a prosecution witness who had been involved with the search for Elma. And he testified that when they returned from the search, Levi had asked if Elma had been found in the Manhattan well, and no one had mentioned this to him yet. So that was a really damning and suspicious piece of evidence. There was also testimony from doctors that there was the first doctor that testified, a Dr. Skinner, was listed as a surgeon, but the defense sort of raised that he was actually a dentist. The thing is, at that point in time, that wasn't super common. He testified that there were marks on Elma's neck and a clicking in her clavicle that would indicate strangulation. The same with the other doctor. So the trial is going quite long. This was really unusual at this point in time. So as compared to nowadays, a murder case, especially a capital murder case, you expect to go on for weeks and you expect a lot of testimony and a lot of evidence. This was not the case in 1800. They expected basically any case or trial to be over in a day. So they were pressing on with the case until the wee hours of the morning. I believe it's 2 a.m. And at that point in time, the judge called a recess, but he sequestered the jury, so they had to sleep on the floor of the courthouse that night. It said they slept upstairs in the courthouse, but on the floor. And then they kicked off again the next morning. On cross-examination, Alexander Hamilton brought out the fact that neither of the 2 doctors testifying for the prosecution had been involved in the original coroner's inquest and autopsy. They had both only examined the body when it was on display at Ring's boarding house. We have changed rooms and I'm now packing up boxes and books in this room. So yet another mess for the video, and hair up because it is friggin' hot. After the prosecution rested, Aaron Burr gave the opening statement. The defense countered the prosecution's claims about Ezra Weeks's sleigh having been out and seen with testimony from Ezra Weeks's apprentice, who stated that he had taken care of the horses that night and they had not been out and the sleigh had not been taken out that night. The apprentice also testified that Levi had been at Ezra Weeks's home that evening discussing business for the next day until at least 10 o'clock. And Ezra Weeks also testified to confirm Levi's alibi that he had been at Ezra's house that night. Ezra Weeks' testimony also pointed out that the reason Levi had asked about the Manhattan well was because Levi had helped Ezra to build that well. And Ezra had already told Levi that the search was happening in Lisbernard's Meadow. Then Doctors Prince and McIntosh were called by the defense, and they were doctors present at the coroner's inquest. They seemed, I don't know, it seems to me like they may have stepped down a little from their findings at the coroner's inquest. They basically testified that they had seen marks on Elma's body and that she was not pregnant, and she had a small amount of water in her lungs that could have indicated drowning. And this played into the first of a few strategies that the defense embraced to raise reasonable doubt. And this first strategy was suicide. They claimed that Elma was suicidal. They brought in testimony that Elma had once joked about overdosing on laudanum, and also testimony that she was sometimes melancholy. And let me tell you, I am sometimes melancholy too, but if you ever find my body floating in a well, I promise you I did not throw myself into the well, just so we're clear. The testimony of the doctors really strongly implied that the coroner's finding that she had been murdered was more based on public pressure than actual medical evidence. But on the other hand, suicide by well was incredibly unlikely at that point in time. Suicide by drowning was much more commonly committed in the Hudson River. The next area of reasonable doubt that the defense worked on raising was that other individuals that might have had a motive to murder Elma. Aaron Burr called Joseph Watkins, a blacksmith whose shop shared a wall, was right next door to, shared a wall with the Rings boarding house, and he believes he shares a wall with Elma's bedroom. And Joseph Watkins testifies that while Catherine Ring was out of town along with many others from the boarding house because of the yellow fever epidemic, Joseph Watkins had heard Elias Ring, the owner of the boarding house and the husband of Elma's cousin, that he had heard Elias Ring enter Elma Sands' bedroom, and he had heard suggestive sounds from the bed and their voices. Basically, he said he had heard carnal encounters. He claimed that this made such an impression on him that he had even commented to his wife about his fear that Elias Ring had ruined the girl. And this isn't the only place in this trial where slut shaming and victim blaming of Elma take place. There were many implications that she dated around and had more than one boyfriend in her life, and that she may even have had premarital sex. But Elias Ring wasn't the only additional person who the defense claimed had a motive to murder Elma. The defense next questioned Richard Croucher, who had also testified for the prosecution. Croucher was a fellow lodger in the boarding house, and he had testified that he had found Levi and Elma in a, quote, compromising position at one point in time. Now, Before we get into the rest of Croucher's testimony, nearly every source on this trial, including the original transcripts, goes into detail about Croucher's appearance. They talk about how he had sinister features or an unpleasant face. And it's all such garbage. It has been proven over and over again that less attractive individuals are treated much more harshly by the justice system, by the legal system, and that more attractive individuals are treated much better and fare much better, and that is just gross and wrong. You can't call it a justice system if the justice is based even partially on what people look like. So let's just ignore any accounts of what it looked like Elma's personality would have been, or what it looked like Croucher's was, or how Levi looked like a good guy, and talk about the evidence. Anyway, Croucher admitted that he had somehow offended Elma while passing her in a hallway one day. There's a book called Duel with the Devil about this case, and it's cited in my references below, down in the description box, all my references every time. And this book suggests that Croucher may have touched her inappropriately, like brushed up against her, or even more extreme inappropriate touching, or that he made an incredibly impertinent comment or act, and that it was such an issue that Croucher almost came to blows with Levi Weeks over this. The defense then introduced a string of witnesses whose combined testimony exposed the fact that Croucher had been primarily responsible for the rumors of Levi's involvement in Elma's disappearance. He had often been seen around the body when it was on display, talking to the people who came by and telling basically anyone who had listened, or who would listen, that Elma had been murdered by her lover, Levi Weeks. There were then witnesses from various stores and taverns who claimed that Croucher had gone into their establishments, basically like announcing the news of Levi's so-called act. Then, in what is probably the most famous moment from this trial, and definitely one of the most inaccurately reported moments from this trial, one grocer testified that a stranger had come into his establishment without any intention to purchase anything, just to sort of spread his bilious announcement that Levi Weeks had killed Elma Sands. The grocer stated that he did not know the name of the man who had come into his store to spread his bile about Levi, and one of the defense attorneys lifted a candle up to Croucher's face in the gallery, and then the grocer confirmed that Croucher was indeed the man who had come into his store to spread these accounts. Now, this is definitely a dramatic and very effective moment in the courtroom. There wasn't electric light at this time, and even in the day, the courtroom would have been quite shadowy, and at night it would have been incredibly dark, especially in the gallery. So that lends, some drama to this candlelight reveal. And yet, accounts of the trial always seem to feel the need to intensify and exaggerate this drama. Whoa. Whew. They intensify and exaggerate the drama. The attorney isn't just lifting a candle to Croucher's face to reveal him, he is dramatically stating and announcing, "Here is your murderer," while waving a candelabra to illuminate the fiend. In some instances, even 2 candelabras. And even which attorney it was that that conducts the reveal is different in different accounts. Aaron Burr, who was actually well known for setting traps for witnesses and having these kinds of dramatic reveals, actually apparently something that Alexander Hamilton hated about Aaron Burr's practice. Aaron Burr, he claimed later that he was the one who had done this candlelight reveal. But then Elizabeth Schuyler, Alexander Hamilton's incredibly underappreciated wife, in the years after his death, claimed that he had been the one to do the candlelight reveal. I have decided that I'm just going to believe that it was the experienced criminal defense attorney Brockholst Livingston who did it, because I don't know, it makes more sense to me, and I don't understand why there's conflicting claims about this anyway. Honestly, the attorney doing the questioning may not have even been the one to raise the candle. I don't know where the questioning attorney was standing in relation to the gallery, but it was probably a team effort anyway. So it was also revealed that Watkins, that blacksmith who lived next door, that he had told Croucher about his suspicions about Elias Ring sneaking into Elma's room, and the defense used this to demonstrate that Croucher may have been able to blackmail Elias Ring into helping him frame Levi Weeks for the murder. The problem for the defense was that Croucher had established an alibi for himself during his testimony. He had said that he was at a party when the crime took place, that he had been at a party. He hadn't been around when Elma was murdered. And so the defense calls up Anne Ashmore, the woman whose house Croucher claimed to have been at. And Anne Ashmore swears in her testimony that Croucher was at her house, but Anne Ashmore testifies that Croucher was at her house, but a string of witnesses thereafter who were also at the party are unable to testify to the actual date the party took place. No one is able to confirm or swear to the date of the party, and this turns out to be because Anne Ashmore was running a still out of her house. And the history of women in alcohol production is very interesting. Let me know in the comments if you want to see a video on that. After that, Aaron Burr made some statements to the jury. He reminded them of the old adage that it is better that 5 guilty men should go free than to have 1 innocent man hang. And by this point, in the trial, there have been over 70 witnesses, and it has pressed on to 2:30 in the morning on the night of the second day of trial. Cadwallader Colden, the prosecutor, requests a recess from the judge to do closing arguments the next day, pointing out that he hasn't slept in 44 hours, and many of the others probably have not as well. But as I mentioned before, this was not a time when it was common for trials to go on for days and days. It just was not the thing that was done. The judge denied the request to recess until the next day, and in a dramatic flourish, Alexander Hamilton announces that the defense will relinquish their closing arguments because their case speaks for itself. So without any closing arguments from either side, the judge speaks to the jury, gives them a summarization and what I would generally call jury instructions, though I don't know if that's what they were referred to as in that time period. And the judge makes a statement that upsets the prosecution. The judge says that in his own opinion, the prosecution's evidence is not strong enough to support a finding of guilty. That said, the judge does not order a directed verdict. So he sends the jury off to deliberate, and they are gone for, wait for it, 5 minutes. You know, accounts vary a little bit here and there, but it's about 5 minutes, and I don't even know how they got the whole jury out of the room and back in with a 5-minute window for deliberation. But it was basically a very, very short deliberation, and when the jury returned, they delivered their finding of not guilty. Some accounts claim that the public was outraged by the verdict. There is a popular myth that Catherine Ring cursed Alexander Hamilton to die an unnatural death outside the courtroom, therefore leading him to his untimely death in his duel with Burr. Alas, this is just a myth. It is from a fictional story based on this trial. It is not true. There are other accounts that say that the public was relieved by the verdict, basically because they had been willing to lynch Levi Weeks just a few days earlier based only on rumors. And lynching, heavy topic, bad thing. Anyway, some accounts say that the public was very in favor and in agreement with the verdict, and honestly, when has the public ever been in agreement about anything one way or the other? I'm sure there are people who are outraged, and I'm sure there are people who are fine with it. I don't understand why all the accounts of this trial are so skewed one way or the other. Public sentiment was also going to shift about the trial a little bit in the days afterward, because there were 3 different accounts of the trial that were published. The first one came a few hours after the trial, and given its speed of publication, it was viewed by many as just a scheme to make money, and it was. All 3 of them were. That's why they did them, to sell them and make money. And yeah, sure, some or all of them may also have been capturing it for posterity, but they also sold them for money. So anyway, the first account was criticized for that. The second account was published by James Hardy, and that was criticized because Hardy did not know shorthand and didn't have a very good view of the trial from where he was sitting. And these criticisms of James Hardy's account of the trial come from the third published account, which was published by William Coleman. He literally started out his account of the trial with a several-page foreword that picked apart both of the other 2 publications and pointed out why theirs weren't as good as his. But his is considered to be the most accurate account, and William Coleman's account of the trial is the reason that the Levi Weeks trial is considered the first recorded murder trial in the US. And the word nerd in me just wants to point out that it is the first recorded trial in the US. It is not transcribed. There's no verbatim record of this trial. If there were, we would know the answer to the mystery of who held up the candle to Richard Croucher's face, but we don't know that. From what I can tell, after the trial, there wasn't much more done in an attempt to actually solve the murder of Elma Sands, or even determine for certain whether it was a murder or suicide. So this very famous murder and the very first murder trial in the US is for a case that remains unsolved to this day. There are a lot of scholars who believe that Richard Croucher was indeed the likely culprit. He had left England before this whole incident because he had trouble with the law there, which included a possible attempted murder. And then not long after the Weeks trial, Croucher was moving out of the Rings boarding house because he had gotten married, and he brought his 13-year-old stepdaughter with him to help him pack up to move out of the boarding house. And while they were in the Rings boarding house, he raped her and then threatened her with Elma's fate if she told anyone what he had done to her. So, I mean, it's not necessarily a confession because, people suspected him, so it's just a threat that carries weight, but it doesn't really matter either way. We now know that he's a total trash bag and a criminal, and thankfully he was convicted for that rape, and he was sentenced to life with hard labor. However, the US wanted to get a running start on its history of not keeping rapists in prison when they should be. And even though he had been sentenced to life with hard labor, for some reason, Richard Croucher was released from prison based on his promise that he would leave the country. And as I'm sure no one would have ever guessed, he didn't leave the country. He went to Virginia. But while he was in Virginia, he ended up getting arrested for theft, and then did end up going back to London, probably sent back to London, may have just gone back to London, I don't know. And while he was in London, according to a very vague account by one of Alexander Hamilton's sons, years later, Richard Croucher in London was put to death for a, quote, heinous crime of some kind. So there are strong reasons that some people believe that Richard Croucher may have been the one who murdered Elma Sands. There are still some who believe that Levi Weeks was indeed the killer, though, and statistics would bear that out. Most of the time when a woman is murdered, it is by the man that she is involved with, statistically, but not always. Levi Weeks, after the trial, moved out of New York to Natchez, Mississippi. Oh, my face is up here. To Natchez, Mississippi. And there he became a well-known and well-respected architect and builder. There are still a couple of historic homes there in Natchez that he built. He got married, had 4 children, and passed away at the age of 43 years old. I am not going to go into the post-trial information for the lawyers and judges and other individuals in this case because there's too much, and honestly, it's Hamilton and Burr primarily, and those are very long stories, but let me know if you want to know more. That that we have just covered is the story of the murder of Elma Sands, also known as the Manhattan Well murder, and the trial of Levi Weeks, the first recorded murder trial in the United States. Please like and subscribe and share this video. If you want to know more about Hamilton and Burr from this weird history perspective, let me know. Or if you want to know more about some of the other weird characters and sort of story threads that we touched on, like the crazy tale of Maria Reynolds, or the remarkably and really underappreciated story of Elizabeth Schuyler, who's Alexander Hamilton's wife, or the mysterious disappearance of Aaron Burr's daughter, or Aaron Burr's crazy treason trial years later, or the disappearance into thin air of Judge Lansing for this case, let me know down in the comments and I will consider doing some of those cases. Thank you for joining me for this week's A Mystery and a Mess. We have cleaned up and also done a lot of packing. Here are your before and after images for the cleaning portion. Who knows when we get a before and after for the packing. Join me again next week for another mystery and another mess. And until then, learn something new and clean up your act.